Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of videos to help you improve your chess game. Today I'd like to cover some of the more common thought process errors. Now, the first thing I want to explain is there's a difference between thought process and thought content, just as there's a difference between the process of learning how to drive a car and where you're actually driving it. Thought process is things like, what do you want to do first? What do you want to do next? If this happens, what do you want to do then? Content is what you're actually finding when you're doing those things. For instance, you could look for checks, captures, and threats. That's a part of your process. But saying, oh, he can play queen a4 check, and then he could win my knight, well, that's not a process, that's the content. So it's very possible that your process can be very good, and then you could make some mistakes in your content just because you're not a computer. You know, humans make mistakes, and even if their process is perfect, they can come up with errors that they would make that would not be process errors. But of course, a lot of players, especially lower rated players, make a ton of different process errors. And in teaching chess over the past quarter century, which has been my full-time job, I've run into a lot of these errors, and in writing my books and my articles and doing my videos, I've decided to name some of them because it's easier to describe something and to have somebody remember it if it has a name rather than just a paragraph that explains it. Probably the most famous one that I've done, and I wrote about it first in a Chess Cafe Skittles Room article in, I believe, 1999 called The Secrets of Real Chess, is hope chess. And I've sort of become relatively famous all over the world with this idea. The only problem is that my original idea of what I meant by hope chess and what I still mean by hope chess does not mean to cover everything that you could hope for in a chess game. And I've seen myself criticized and commented on and given credit for all these things that I really never meant. So for instance, let's talk about some of the things you can hope for in chess that is not what I meant. You could hope for that you're going to play an attack, and you're going to hope that your opponent misplays the defense. You could make a threat and hope your opponent doesn't see it so you can carry it out. You could make a bad move, and then you could realize it, and then you could hope that your opponent doesn't refute it. You could try some unclear attack and then hope that your opponent plays it wrong. There's just a ton of things that you can hope for in chess. And I really didn't mean all those things, but I've been given credit for it, so I guess I have to, take the good with the bad in that sense. So what I really meant by hope chess was you make a move, and when you make that move, you don't look at what your opponent can do to you on the next move. You don't look at his checks, his captures, and his threats. And then when he makes one, you go, uh-oh, what am I going to do about that? And then you hope that you might have an answer. And of course, if you don't, if he makes a threat for which there was no response, then you could just lose the game because you hadn't anticipated that. All right, so I have in front of me one of my favorite examples. Oops, don't want to do that. One of my favorite examples of hope chess. And one of my students was playing white here in this endgame. And I think I showed this endgame before in one of my videos, maybe on hope chess. But white's winning with something like queen f3 check, and now black can't play king e1 because of mate. King g1, queen f2 check, king h1, queen checks, king up, queen checks again, and it doesn't really matter where black goes. White will check again, and now there's two ways white can win the game. If black puts the queen in the way, white will simply trade, bring his king up, and take off the pawn on c6. Or black, probably better, would be something like king h4 and allow queen takes c6 when we have a table-based endgame here. But instead of playing that correct line, white played rather quickly, which is often what happens when people are playing hope chess, and playing too quickly for the circumstance is certainly a type of process error because your process shouldn't finish until you do all the steps that you're supposed to do. And if you end your process too soon, which means you're playing too fast, then that is, in a sense, is a type of process error. But in any case, white here played the unbelievably bad move, queen h1 check. And the reason why this is such a great example of hope chess is he couldn't possibly have looked at what black would do on the next move, because he's forcing black to win the game, something you almost never see. Black only has one legal move here, and if you didn't look for that legal move, then that's the greatest example of hook chess we could say, because black is forced to play queen g1 check with a double attack on h1 and e3. If white doesn't want to lose the queen, he takes queen takes g1 check, king takes g1, and now white tries to stop the pawn with king to f3, and black would simply push that pawn, get a queen, and win. So white actually forces black to win the game. So obviously he's not looking at black's checks, captures, and threats on the next move, because black is forced to check him and win the game on the next move. Quite an amazing turnaround. Okay, I'd like to talk about an old term that I didn't make up, and it's called a wood pusher. A wood pusher is someone who just pushes wood around the board and really doesn't think about his moves very much. And I have a similar term which I call hand waving, but hand waving and wood pushing are not quite the same thing. So let's take an example of wood pushing here. Hold on a sec. Okay, this is a recent student game where my student was playing white, and white had just played the correct move, knight e5, with threats like knight takes c6 check and knight to f7 check. And black did the best he could and played knight takes e5. And now white has two different ways to capture back on e5. He can take with the d pawn and discover an attack on the queen with the bishop, or he could take with the queen, queen takes e5, and hit the rook on h8. So both of those threats are quite easily met. If you take with d takes e5, the queen can simply go back to, say, queen b6. If you play queen takes e5, the rook can simply move to something like f8 or e8 or something like that. So in each case, when you recapture one way or the other, you're going to make a threat, but black will easily meet that threat. However, what happens after that can be quite different. And any good player, when he sees that he has these two different recaptures, which lead to two different types of positions, would take a little time here and try to figure out which of these two attacks makes the most sense. I think most good players would take with the pawn here, because the opening of the bishop, it's not so much you want to win the queen or anything. The queen will just go back. It's that it opens the line for the bishop and it opens the line for the rook. While if you play queen takes e5, you're not really opening lines for either piece. But if you just play the move based on opening lines, that's what I call hand waving. But white really didn't do that, because he didn't take enough time to try to compare those ideas, not even to hand wave. White had, I think, 27 minutes on his clock plus a 45-second increment. And here white played queen takes e5 in 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Well, that's obviously a process error of playing too fast. But I wouldn't really call that hand waving, because in order to hand wave, you really have to look at some different principles that would apply to the position and make your move on those principles. And in 2 seconds, I don't even think you can name a principle in 2 seconds. So white probably just saw that if he takes the knight with the queen, that attacks the rook on h8, and he was happy to do that. So he played queen takes e5. So that's wood pushing. Wood pushing is where you really don't give your move much thought. You just make a move and see what happens. That's wood pushing. What's hand waving? Hand waving is where you have a move that requires some critical analysis, and instead of doing the critical analysis, you rely on some sort of principles to make your move. Here, as I said, I don't think white did that, so let's look at a better example of hand waving. It's the one I usually give. I gave it in my first video. I've used it a lot for examples of hand waving. And let's see here. If I can type correctly, it would help. Okay, so let's go to the end here. Okay, so you may have seen this before in one of my other videos, but it's a really good hand waving example. I've given this position to many students, and in order to figure out what white wants to do, you have to do some careful analysis. But what some of the weaker students do in this position is they say, well, if I take with the king, I'm attacking the pawn on f7. If I take with the king, I'm not doubling my pawns. And if I take with the e pawn, e takes f6, I'm not only doubling my pawns, but I'm isolating my pawns, and doubled isolated pawns are bad. So based on those principles, I think I should take with the king. That's an excellent example of hand waving. Hand waving is just taking quickly with the king here, based on the fact that the king's attacking the pawn on f7. You're not doubling your pawns, you're not isolating your pawns. But what you really want to do is analyze king takes f7 to see if it's a good move, to see if white is really winning, and analyze e takes f6 to see if white's winning there, and play the one that gets you the best result. If they both draw, play the one that's harder for black to draw against. If they both win, play the one that's easier to win. And if one of them wins and one of them draws, then obviously play the one that wins. But to just take the bishop quickly with the king based on the fact that you don't want to double your pawns or you don't want to isolate your pawns, that's hand waving. Okay, so we've talked about hope chess, we've talked about hand waving, we've talked about wood pushing. Another common error that I find in thought process is when people look for danger, instead of analyzing the checks, captures, and threats, what they do is they just use their tactical vision to look around to see if the move looks safe. And if they don't see any dangerous patterns, then they play the move based on their tactical vision. And that's a process error, because the process really should be to use your tactical vision, and if it doesn't see any danger, to then analyze the position. And I think I used an example of that recently. It was White's move. White was a mid-thousands player, about 1550, and he should castle here, castle early and often, but he decided that his knight on e5 would look pretty good, and he looked at it and he used his tactical vision, and he decided that knight e5 was guarded twice, it was attacked twice, I couldn't take it, black couldn't play knight takes e5 because the d takes e5 forking to pieces, so his tactical vision told him that knight e5 was safe. But again, as I said, that's a process error, because he really didn't go through the right process, which is to check all of black's checks, captures, and threats. And what black did is black played bishop takes. I think white took with the bishop, black took again, white took with the pawn, and then knight g4, hitting the pawn, and now black can't guard it because of something like queen takes e3 check. And if white had taken the other way, d takes e5, black could not only play knight g4 and win the pawn the same way, but he actually has a second way of winning the pawn, which is to play knight to h5 to remove the guard of this pawn. And if the bishop plays to f4, I think he can play something like g5 and again remove the guard. For instance, bishop g3, knight takes, pawn takes, king g7 to guard the h6 pawn, and now knight takes e5 is unstoppable. Again, you can't play f4 because the queen takes e3 check, and black's winning a pawn. So the process error, and I see this error a lot in my students who are rated between, let's say, 1200 and 1700, they look at the board and they don't actually analyze whether their move is safe, and especially this happens when they're playing these 15 and 20 minute games where they don't have a lot of time to do it right anyway. And they just make the move, and then afterwards, when they play a move like knight e5 and black plays bishop takes, pawn takes, let's say knight g4, and wins the pawn, they say, oh, I didn't see that. I didn't see that. But really what they didn't do is they didn't look for it. They didn't analyze it. They just looked for danger. They didn't see any danger, and then they ended up losing it. All right, so let's see. Another thought process error is quiescence errors. Well, I've gone a lot with quiescence errors, but let's set up a position. Let's say white's going to play something like this. Only a beginner would fall for this kind of quiescence error. Whoops, let's put the queen on a6. All right, so here it's, sorry, we don't want to have white in check. That would be bad also. All right, so white to play and win. All right, everybody knows this. It's easy. Queen to e8 check, rook takes e8, rook takes e8, checkmate. All right, well, but a beginner might look at this and say, I can't play queen to e8 because he takes my rook with the queen, and I will lose the queen, so I can't go there. So to not play that is called a quiescence error. Well, nobody's going to fall for this kind of quiescence error. It's too easy. But all you have to do is look at other positions where I've seen millions of quiescence errors, and I had a whole game that was what I called the Immortal Quiescence Error game. Let's see if I can bring it up. It's game number 251. Let's pause. Okay, so in this game, let's go forward for about 58 moves, 58 half moves. All right, so white plays queen takes c5, and black plays g4. What should white do? Well, black's threatening to take on h3, and white can't take back, so he could stop that threat by moving the king, but actually the best way to stop that threat is to counterattack with rook takes b7. And this is actually pretty easy. If black plays rook takes b7, white will take off the knight. The black king has nowhere to go but to go back to f7, and now white can take the rook, and he's going to end up with a rook, a knight, and a pawn for his investment of the rook on the first move. But in the game, white didn't want to play rook takes b7 because he didn't want to lose a rook for a pawn. So he played a move like h4 to keep the king side closed. You know, again, he told me after the game, oh, rook takes b7. I didn't look any further. I just saw I was losing a rook. So after h4, black plays pawn takes. And now if white wants to play rook takes b7, that doesn't work as well because of rook takes g2 check, king h1, and then queen takes b7 guards the knight. But instead, white could play a move like knight takes f4 check. And if black plays pawn takes, white can play queen d5 check. And now if the king goes to the 7th rank, white has rook takes b7 check. For instance, king e7, rook takes b7 check, and the knight's hanging again. If black plays king to f6, white has queen f5 check, king e7, and then rook checks. And it's practically mate here. So he could do that. Again, he said, oh, I didn't want to lose the knight for a pawn. So instead, he just captured back with the rook. And now black attacks the pawn. But black's not really threatening mate. He's just threatening to win the pawn. So again, white could play something like, you know, rook takes b7 check, I believe. Let's see, Stockfish, is that the best? No, Stockfish says this one is better again for similar reasons to before. If rook takes b7 check, that doesn't work because, again, rook takes check followed by queen takes b7. So it's the knight f4 is the right move here, and white is completely winning. It says mate in 14. Again, white didn't do that. He just saw the threat on g2. He brought his rook back to guard it. Black brings his rook up to threat in h4. And now, let's see if, will both of them work? I don't think so. I think as long as the queen can take on b2, the rook takes b7 doesn't work. But I'm pretty sure knight f4 check is still working. Rook takes f4. White can play queen d5 check. If the king goes back, we've got rook takes b7 winning the queen. If the king goes to f6, we've got queen d6 check. King g7. Here comes that rook b7 check, and you get the idea. So anyway, white kept missing these ideas of knight f4 and rook takes b7. These are very typical, you know, quiescence errors that are made by intermediate players. They just see, oh, I can't do that, and they don't really look further to see if they do that, what's going to happen after that. They don't analyze the position carefully. So that's called a quiescence error. All right, let's look at another one. All right, this is a position that's part of a quiz that I give a lot of my students. Black is pinning the knight to the king with queen e7. What are all the moves that white has that might save the knight? Well, it turns out there's basically 4. He could play f4, bishop f4, queen e2, and castle. One of them, though, has a problem. Which one is it? Well, it turns out it's bishop f4. And why is bishop f4 a problem? Well, when I give this to lower-rated students, they want to play a move like knight fd7 and keep piling up on that knight and threatening to play f6. The problem with a move like that, which piles up on the knight, is white can simply castle. And now if black tries to win the piece, white will pin the queen to the king. So those kind of moves don't work. But when I show this to higher rated players, they look at this and they kind of laugh and they say, oh, well, if white plays bishop f4, I'm just going to play, and if you don't know what it is, you can pause the video. And the answer is you want to use an AWL. What's AWL? Well, I have a whole video on that too. Attack with something worth less. And the answer is simply attack the bishop with a pawn. Well, a lot of my lower rated students filter that out. They look at that move and they say, I can't do that. He would just take the pawn and I would lose the pawn. Well, that's a quiescence error. It's a quiescence error because this is removal of the guard. White takes the pawn. He's deflected off of the guard of the knight. And black plays queen takes knight check. And unless white wants to lose the bishop also, white will have to trade queens even though he's down a pawn. And play queen to e2 and white loses a piece. So to not see this move g5, which is an AWL, you're always supposed to be looking for AWLs. To not see that move g5 or to see it and have your brain kind of reject it quickly, that's an example of a quiescence error. Okay, next kind of error is what I call acquiescing. Acquiescing is when your opponent makes a threat and you don't immediately see what you can do about it, and you assume that there's no answer, and then you quickly just make a move and let him have what he was threatening, when in fact if you had taken your time and analyzed carefully, there might actually have been something you could do. Let's take a look at this. Okay, in this position, white has just played h takes g6 check. Black only has one legal move. And here he plays... Oh, sorry, let's go back a move. White plays queen g6 check. And black, it's black's move. And here he has two moves. He could play king to h8, or he could take the queen. So, what should he do? Well, if he analyzes it, he'll realize, oh, if I take the queen, then white has a mating pattern. But instead, black assumed, oh, okay, I have to take the queen here. And he just acquiesces to the sacrifice when he really doesn't have to. And he takes the queen, and after pawn takes check, he resigns because king h8, rook h1 is checkmate. All right, here's another example of acquiescing. Black to play. White has just sacrificed on h7. And now black's got a problem. If he moves the knight, then queen h8 is mate because the knight is guarding the f7 square. So black assumed that he had no defense. And I think he played a move like bishop to e4 trying to guard it. And then white can probably just play rook takes e4, and that just delays the inevitable. But what black should do, instead of quickly moving and saying this doesn't work, he should realize, wait a second, I'm up material here. I can give back some material to try to get into a reasonable position. And what he should play is queen takes f2 check, which loses a rook for a pawn, but he's already up a piece. And after queen takes, rook takes, king takes, black could just play something like knight f6, where he's down the exchange for a pawn, but he has a powerful queenside majority, and he has enough compensation that white's advantage, according to Stockfish, is very small. So he just gave in and figured, well, this is a losing threat, and he forgot that he was far enough ahead that he could trade queens there. All right, the last thought process error we're going to look at is where people look at a move and say, what does that move do? Instead of saying, what are all the things that move does? And then what happens is they miss some of the things that the move does, and they mess it up. So let's take a look at one or two of those. Okay, in this position, white has just played queen to e3 to threaten the knight on f4. And black has several ways to save the knight. He could play knight h5, he could play knight g6, or he could play queen f6. So black plays queen f6, and white says, okay, he came out to guard the knight, and maybe I'll put my rook on that same line to get ready to pin it. And he plays rook f2, and black says, well, I'm not just guarding the knight, I'm also threatening actually mate with the rook on d2. And he plays queen a1 check, and white goes, oh, whoops, I didn't see that. king d2, queen takes h1, and black wins material. So here white thought the only thing, he was forcing black to save the knight, and when black saved the knight, he said, oh, I know why he played queen f6 to guard the knight, and his board vision didn't show him this check. What's actually funny is he's lucky that he didn't try to pin the knight with the other rook, because then queen to a1 would have been mate. But he was just lucky, and he tried to pin it with this rook. He ended up losing the material anyway, but at least he didn't get checkmated. All right, in this position, it's white's turn, and black's threatening bishop takes g2. White plays bishop takes b7 to save his bishop. He figures, well, what's black going to do? He's going to get his recapture. He plays queen takes b7. White says, oh, I know why he did that. He did that because he has to recapture the bishop. That gives me a chance to win a pawn because I can fork his queen and king, and he's got to take me with the bishop. And the bishop takes, and then white takes back, and black says, yes, but when I recapture the bishop, I was also threatening your rook, and he plays queen takes h1 check. So again, the process error for white is he's figuring, oh, if I take the bishop, I know why the queen's taking the bishop. Well, it's true, the queen's taking the bishop to recapture, but that's not the only thing it does. You don't want to ask, why did he make that move? You want to ask, what are all the things that move does? Well, bishop takes b7, recaptures the bishop, and attacks the rook on h1. Okay, in our final example of thought process errors, we're looking at thought process errors where someone asks, why did he make that move, instead of what are all the things that move does. And here, it's black's turn, and black plays h5, hitting the knight, and white plays knight f2, and black says, I know why he played knight f2. He played knight f2 to save the knight, so black does something like rook to c4, and white says, oh, but when I moved the knight, it was also a discovered attack on the pawn. I'll play queen takes h5, which, doesn't really attack the rook or the bishop. They're both guarded, but it wins an important pawn because black was up some pawns for the piece earlier, and now white just gets a free pawn here. So again, black's not paying attention when white moves the knight. So these are all thought process errors. What have we talked about today? We've talked about hope chess. We've talked about relying only on your tactical vision to see if your move is safe. We've talked about hand waving. We've talked about wood pushing. We've talked about quiescence errors. We've talked about acquiescing. We've talked about not asking what are all the things the move does, and just asking why did he make that move. These are not all the type of thought process errors, but these are some of the more common ones that people do, and when they make those kind of errors, then bad things can happen. So hopefully after watching this video, you'll be more aware of these kind of errors, and you'll take some time, and when you're playing your slow games, you'll be able to use a better process and possibly minimize the kind of errors that we talked about today. All right, if you liked today's video, please hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do that. Hit the subscribe button. The more subscribes we have, the better. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.